July 19th, 1940. The Kroll Opera House in Berlin blazed with lights and Nazi pageantry as Adolf Hitler strode to the podium before the Reichstag. His generals arrayed behind him in crisp uniforms, medals gleaming. The Führer had just promoted 12 of them to field marshal in a ceremony dripping with triumph. France had fallen. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, all conquered in a campaign so swift it seemed to rewrite the rules of warfare itself. Hitler stood at the pinnacle of his power, master of continental Europe, and now he would make his grand gesture. He would offer Britain peace, generous terms, one final chance to avoid annihilation. But in London, 600 miles away, Winston Churchill sat in a smoke-filled room at 10 Downing Street, a glass of whiskey at his elbow, his jaw set in that familiar bulldog expression that had come to define British defiance. He'd already decided. Before Hitler even opened his mouth, Churchill knew his answer. There would be no negotiation, no peace, no surrender, not ever. What Hitler said when Churchill refused his final peace offer would reveal something profound about both men and set in motion a chain of events that would determine whether Britain survived the summer of 1940. The speech Hitler delivered that night was carefully crafted, almost plaintive in places. He spoke for nearly 2 hours, his voice rising and falling with practiced emotion, broadcast across Europe so that millions could hear him position himself as the reasonable statesman, the man of peace forced into war by British intransigence. In this hour, I feel it to be my duty before my own conscience to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain as much as elsewhere, Hitler declared, his words translated simultaneously for foreign listeners. I consider myself in a position to make this appeal since I am not the vanquished begging favors, but the victor speaking in the name of reason. I can see no reason why this war must go on. He painted a picture of Germany's military dominance, not with crude threats, but with the confidence of a man stating obvious facts. The Wehrmacht had crushed every army it faced. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies over the continent. Britain stood alone, its French ally defeated, its army evacuated from Dunkirk with most of its heavy equipment abandoned on the beaches. What possible hope did the British have? Mr. Churchill ought, perhaps, for once, to believe me when I prophesy that a great empire will be destroyed. Hitler continued, his tone shifting to something almost sorrowful. An empire which it was never my intention to destroy, or even to harm. I do realize that this struggle, if it continues, can end only with the complete annihilation of one or the other of the two adversaries. Mr. Churchill may believe this will be Germany. I know it will be Britain. The Reichstag erupted in applause. The field marshals nodded gravely. Foreign correspondents scribbled notes, some genuinely wondering if Churchill might accept. Hitler had framed his offer brilliantly, not as a demand for surrender, but as a magnanimous gesture from a victor who preferred peace to further bloodshed. He was giving Britain a way out, a chance to preserve its empire, avoid invasion, save countless lives. But Hitler fundamentally misunderstood the man he was dealing with. Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the same day Germany invaded France and the Low Countries. He'd inherited a government riddled with defeatists, a military reeling from disaster, and a public still traumatized by the losses of the Great War. Many in Britain's ruling class, including Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, believed negotiation was the only sensible option. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Britain couldn't win alone. Better to negotiate from a position of some strength, preserve the empire, avoid the destruction of British cities. Churchill had faced down these voices in a series of brutal war cabinet meetings in late May, as France collapsed and the British Expeditionary Force fought desperately to escape encirclement at Dunkirk. Halifax had argued for approaching Mussolini to mediate peace talks. Churchill had refused with a vehemence that shocked his colleagues. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground, Churchill had told his cabinet on May 28, 1940. Not poetic rhetoric for public consumption, a private statement of absolute determination to his own ministers, some of whom thought him mad. He'd taken his case to the full cabinet, 30 men who could have overruled him, forced his resignation, installed Halifax as a more reasonable prime minister. Churchill had spoken for several minutes, pacing, gesturing with his cigar, painting a picture not of Britain's military prospects, which were grim, but of what negotiation with Hitler would mean. Nations which went down fighting rose again, but those which surrendered tamely were finished, he'd said. The men around the table had risen to their feet, some with tears in their eyes, and declared they would back him. No negotiation. Britain would fight on alone. That had been 7 weeks before Hitler's speech. Churchill had already made his position brutally clear in public, in words that had electrified not just Britain, but the world. On June 4th, after the miracle of Dunkirk, 338,000 men evacuated, though with almost all their equipment lost. Churchill had addressed Parliament and through them the British people. We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender. On June 18th, as France signed its humiliating armistice in the same railway car where Germany had surrendered in 1918, Churchill had delivered another speech that defined Britain's position. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves that, if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say this was their finest hour. These weren't the words of a man preparing to negotiate. Hitler, incredibly, seemed not to grasp this. Or perhaps he believed that Churchill's rhetoric was just that. Rhetoric, the bluster of a politician who would become reasonable once the full weight of Germany's military power became clear. In the German High Command, many officers had assumed Britain would seek terms after France fell. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, had written in his diary on June 30th, "The Führer is greatly puzzled by Britain's persisting unwillingness to make peace. He sees the answer, as we do, in Britain's hope of Russia." Hitler had even delayed his Reichstag speech by several days, partly hoping for some signal from London that negotiations might be possible. None came. British fighters continued to clash with German aircraft over the Channel. The Royal Navy maintained its aggressive patrols. Churchill's speeches grew more defiant, not less. So Hitler made his last appeal to reason, genuinely believing, or at least hoping, that the British government would recognize reality. He offered no specific terms in the speech, but the implication was clear. Britain could keep its empire, its independence, its dignity. All it had to do was acknowledge Germany's dominance in Europe and stop fighting. The speech ended at 10:30 p.m. Berlin time. Foreign correspondents rushed to file their reports. In neutral capitals, Washington, Moscow, Rome, diplomats analyzed every word, trying to gauge whether this might actually lead to peace. In London, the BBC monitored the German broadcast, translators working frantically to produce an English version. Churchill didn't bother to listen to the whole thing. He'd been briefed on the key points and dismissed it immediately. "I will not negotiate with that man," he told his private secretary, John Colville. His contempt was absolute, visceral. Hitler was a gangster, a liar who'd broken every agreement he'd ever made. The Munich Agreement, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the promises to Czechoslovakia, all lies. Why would he honor terms offered to Britain? But Churchill faced a political problem. He couldn't simply ignore Hitler's offer. The British public, exhausted by war, needed to hear a response. More importantly, neutral nations, especially the United States, needed to see that Britain had seriously considered and rejected Hitler's terms on principle, not out of stubborn foolishness. Churchill made a calculated decision. He wouldn't dignify Hitler's speech with a personal response. That would elevate it, make it seem like a genuine negotiation between equals. Instead, he had Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, respond on BBC Radio on July 22nd, 3 days after Hitler's speech. The delay itself was a message. Britain wasn't rushing to respond because there was nothing to consider. Halifax's broadcast was devastating in its dismissiveness. "We shall not stop fighting until freedom is secure," Halifax declared in his aristocratic accent, his tone suggesting he was discussing something slightly distasteful. Hitler's so-called peace offer is not an offer at all. It is a summons to capitulate. We will not capitulate. But even before Halifax's official response, British newspapers had made the government's position clear. On July 20th, the day after Hitler's speech, the Daily Express ran the headline, "Hitler's peace offer rejected." The Times was only slightly more measured. "Hitler's offer, no peace without honor." The British government had consulted no one, considered nothing. The answer had been decided weeks before Hitler spoke. Churchill's determination had become Britain's policy. When word of Britain's rejection reached Berlin, Hitler's reaction was volcanic. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later armaments minister, was present at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, when news of the British response arrived. He was furious, Speer later recalled. He paced back and forth, ranting about British stupidity, their inability to see reason. He'd expected them to accept, or at least to negotiate. The flat rejection enraged him. Hitler had genuinely believed Britain would negotiate. His entire worldview was built on racial hierarchies and power relationships. Germany had demonstrated overwhelming power. Britain, in Hitler's mind, should recognize this reality and submit. That's how the world worked. The strong dominated, the weak submitted. Britain's refusal violated this natural order. But there was more to Hitler's fury than wounded pride. The rejection created a massive strategic problem. Hitler had never wanted war with Britain. He'd hoped to intimidate them into neutrality while he pursued his real goal, destroying the Soviet Union and seizing Lebensraum, living space, in the East. Britain's continued resistance meant Germany faced a two-front war, the nightmare scenario that had destroyed the Kaiser's Germany in the Great War. On July 16th, 3 days before his Reichstag speech, Hitler had already issued Directive Number 16, the order to prepare for the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. The directive's opening words revealed his frustration. As England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, still shows no signs of willingness to come to terms, I've decided to prepare, and if necessary to carry out, a landing operation against her. The phrasing was telling. If necessary. Hitler still hoped his speech might make invasion unnecessary. When Britain rejected his offer, that hope died. The military implications were profound. The German High Command had been planning Operation Sea Lion with growing unease. Unlike the campaigns in Poland, France, and the Low Countries, invading Britain required something Germany had never attempted: a massive amphibious assault across a defended sea against an enemy with naval superiority. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht operations staff, had written a memo outlining the challenges. The landing operation must be a surprise crossing on a broad front. The most difficult part will be the continued reinforcement of equipment and stores. We cannot count on supplies captured in England. The Kriegsmarine, German Navy, was even more pessimistic. Grand Admiral Erik Raeder had lost most of his surface fleet in the Norway campaign. He had no specialized landing craft, no experience with amphibious operations on this scale, and faced the Royal Navy, still the world's most powerful naval force despite losses. The Navy cannot guarantee protection of the invasion fleet against the Royal Navy. Raeder had told Hitler bluntly, we would need absolute air superiority over the Channel, and even then, success is uncertain. That meant Everything depended on the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring's air force. Göring, corpulent and vain, had promised Hitler that his aircraft could destroy the Royal Air Force, sink British warships, and protect the invasion fleet. His confidence was boundless. His understanding of what he was promising was less certain. After Britain's rejection, Hitler summoned his military chiefs to the Berghof on July 31st. The meeting revealed the chaos behind Germany's apparent strength. Hitler ranted about British stupidity, then turned to the invasion plan. He wanted it executed in September, before autumn weather made channel crossings impossible. His generals exchanged glances. Halder spoke carefully. The preparations cannot be completed before mid-September at the earliest. We need specialized landing craft, trained troops, extensive reconnaissance. The Navy says they need until mid-September. The Luftwaffe must first achieve air superiority. Hitler waved this away. Göring assures me the Luftwaffe can destroy the RAF in a matter of weeks. Once we control the air, the British will see reason. They may even surrender without invasion. It was wishful thinking, but Hitler clung to it. He'd been proven right so often: the Rhineland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, that he'd begun to believe his instincts were infallible. Surely the British would crack once German bombs started falling on their cities. In London, Churchill watched German preparations with grim determination. British intelligence tracked the assembly of invasion barges in Channel ports, the movement of German divisions to the coast, the Luftwaffe's build-up of forces. The invasion was coming. Everyone knew it. Churchill toured coastal defenses, inspected troops, visited RAF fighter stations. He was 65 years old, overweight, drinking too much, sleeping too little, but he radiated defiance. Soldiers who met him remembered his absolute confidence that Britain would win. Not hope, certainty. We are fighting by ourselves alone, but we are not fighting for ourselves alone, Churchill told munitions workers in a factory. We are fighting for our lives, but we are also fighting for the future of the world. He'd also sent increasingly urgent messages to President Franklin Roosevelt in Washington, begging for American support. Not troops. Roosevelt couldn't send troops, not with American public opinion overwhelmingly opposed to entering the war, but weapons, ships, aircraft, supplies, anything to help Britain survive. Roosevelt wanted to help. He despised Hitler, understood that British defeat would leave America facing a Nazi-dominated Europe, but he faced political constraints. An election was coming in November 1940. His opponent would crucify him if he seemed to be dragging America into another European war. Roosevelt walked a tightrope, providing what aid he could while maintaining the fiction of neutrality. The Destroyer for Bases deal, announced in September 1940, exemplified this balancing act. America would provide 50 old destroyers to the Royal Navy in exchange for 99-year leases on British naval bases in the Caribbean and Newfoundland. It was framed as a business transaction, not aid to a belligerent. Churchill hated giving up the bases, but needed the ships desperately. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe launched what became known as the Battle of Britain. Beginning in earnest in August 1940, German aircraft attacked RAF airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories, trying to destroy Britain's air defenses. Göring had promised Hitler he could achieve air superiority in 4 days. 4 weeks later, the RAF was still fighting. The battle was desperate, brutal, fought by young men barely out of their teens. RAF pilots flew multiple sorties per day, landing only to refuel and rearm before going back up. Many were killed on their first missions. Others survived dozens of combats, their nerves shredded, their hands shaking from exhaustion. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few, Churchill said of the RAF pilots in August 1940. It was more than rhetoric. Fewer than 3,000 fighter pilots stood between Britain and invasion. The Luftwaffe had numerical superiority, but the RAF had advantages Hitler hadn't counted on. British radar could detect incoming raids, allowing fighters to be vectored to intercept. RAF pilots fought over their own territory. If shot down, they could return to their squadrons. German pilots who bailed out became prisoners, and the Spitfire and Hurricane fighters, while not superior to the Bf-109 in all respects, were good enough. By early September, Goering changed tactics. Frustrated by his inability to destroy the RAF, angered by a British bombing raid on Berlin, he ordered the Luftwaffe to attack London and other cities. The Blitz had begun. It was a strategic blunder. Attacking cities gave the RAF time to recover, repair airfields, rebuild strength, but it also tested British morale in ways that aerial combat hadn't. German bombers came night after night, dropping high explosives and incendiaries on London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool. Thousands of civilians died, entire neighborhoods burned. Churchill walked through the rubble, tears streaming down his face, giving his V for victory sign to people sheltering in underground stations. "We can take it," Londoners told him. And they did. The Blitz killed 43,000 British civilians by May 1941, but it didn't break British morale. If anything, it hardened resistance. Hitler watched the Blitz with growing frustration. The British weren't cracking, the RAF wasn't destroyed, the Royal Navy still controlled the Channel. Operation Sea Lion kept being postponed. September 15th, then September 20th, then October. Finally, on October 12th, Hitler postponed it indefinitely. The Führer has decided that from now on until the spring, preparations for Sea Lion shall be continued solely for the purpose of maintaining political and military pressure on England, read the official directive. It was a face-saving formula. The invasion was cancelled. Hitler's fury at Churchill's rejection had led to the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and ultimately to Germany's first major defeat. The Luftwaffe had lost over 700 aircraft and their crews. British morale had been tested and held. The United States had moved closer to intervention, and Hitler had learned something he didn't want to believe. That will could triumph over apparent military logic, that a nation could choose to fight even when the odds seemed hopeless. In his Reichstag speech, Hitler had said, "I can see no reason why this war must go on." Churchill had answered with actions, not words. The reason the war must go on was that Britain would not live under Nazi domination. It was that simple, that absolute. Hitler never made another peace offer to Britain. His attention turned east toward the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, launched in June 1941. Hitler told his generals that once Russia was crushed, Britain would have to make peace. He was wrong again. Britain fought on, now with a powerful ally. The final peace offer of July 1940 marked a turning point. Hitler had expected Churchill to be reasonable, to recognize reality, to submit to superior force. Instead, Churchill had shown that some things mattered more than military calculations. Freedom, honor, the refusal to bow to tyranny. What Hitler said when Churchill refused his peace offer revealed the limits of the Führer's understanding. He could comprehend military power, territorial conquest, racial hierarchy. He couldn't comprehend a man who would choose certain devastation over submission, who would risk everything rather than compromise with evil. Churchill understood something Hitler never could. That nations, like individuals, are defined not by what they gain, but by what they refuse to surrender. Britain in 1940 had little chance of military victory, but it had something more powerful, the determination to remain free or die trying. That determination, born in Churchill's stubborn refusal to negotiate, sustained Britain through the darkest days of the war. It inspired resistance movements across occupied Europe. It convinced Roosevelt that Britain was worth supporting, that the British would fight to the end. And ultimately, It helped ensure that when victory finally came in 1945, it was won by free nations, not by those who had chosen the easier path of submission. Hitler's fury at Churchill's rejection was the rage of a man who'd built his entire worldview on the belief that power determined everything, that the strong naturally dominated the weak. Churchill's refusal shattered that belief. It proved that courage, will, and moral conviction could stand against overwhelming force. The consequences of that July 1940 exchange echoed across the next 5 years of war. Hitler had offered peace, expecting acceptance. Churchill had offered defiance, accepting war. One man believed might made right. The other believed some things were worth any price to preserve. History records who was proven correct.